Welcome to 5 Good Questions. I'm your host, Jake Taylor. Our guest today is Maya Peterson. Maya is a current high school student who values the power of investing at a young age. Her goal is to educate those around her about the power of compounding with talks and workshops. Today we're going to be discussing her book, Early Bird, The Power of Investing Young. Let's ask Maya 5 good questions. But first, I'm happy to announce my literary debut, The Rebel Allocator, is now available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. You could say it's about time. I've been pouring my heart into this book for more than 3 years. A well-known SoCal billionaire received an early copy of the book and actually called me to say he enjoyed the story and was adamant that I get it made into a movie. Talk about a surreal experience getting 20 minutes on the phone with one of my heroes. My friend Tobias Carlisle had this to say: Jacob Taylor has written a modern-day investment classic. The Rebel Allocator is reminiscences of a stock operator for value investors. It's a fictionalized retelling of the lessons in The Intelligent Investor in an accessible page-turner. If you want to learn how to invest like Warren Buffett by sitting at his knee, this is the book for you. Wow, how flattering is that? I was blown away when he sent me that. I've created dozens of ad-free author interviews over the last 5 years and never asked for anything in return. If you've gotten any value out of these efforts, please do me a personal favor and pick up a copy of The Rebel Allocator. I promise you won't regret it. And now, on with the show. All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. My guest today is Maya Peterson, and she is the author of Early Bird. Hey, Maya, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is awesome.
So, we had the chance meeting in Omaha this year. How many times have you been now to the Berkshire meeting?
Oh, probably, I think 5 times. This is my 5th year. I've been coming since I was 11.
That's very impressive.
Thank you.
So this book that you wrote is basically really for young people specifically to help them, or really anybody who maybe feels a little overwhelmed by all of the information that's out there about investing. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head for that audience. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really just for beginners. And I've had people who buy it for like a younger sibling or a niece or nephew, and then they end up reading it as like a 40 or 50-year-old and really enjoy it and buy second copies. So it's awesome.
Yeah. So question number 1 is, where did your passion for investing come from? And what inspired you to write a book at, you're 16 or 17 right now?
16, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was always really interested in business. And so I've told this story a lot. But I started a camp called Camp Kids, which was basically like babysitting and math. And so I had a ton of kids from the neighborhood, and I sent out flyers, and I had my friend who was super interested in babysitting, and I was super interested in business. And so I had 90% profit margins, which I didn't know at the time, but I was now really proud of looking back. And so I gained a little bit of money, just like babysitting money from that. And my parents were like, well, what are you going to do with this? And I've never been the person who enjoys spending it. I would tend to trade like my brother's toy dolls with money, and neither of those seemed to have a lot of value to either of us because we're young, but I would always enjoy the money more than the actual doll. And so I decided to just start learning about investing, and I got really interested in buy what you know. And so I invested in Mattel and Hasbro. Obviously, Mattel has done horribly. So it's like my worst investment because I've learned a ton from it. Right. And I've also grown a lot, but also not done too well. And so then I started a blog, maybe if that was when I was like 9, I started a blog when I was 13. And it was called Compounding Snowballs. And I started it over the summer, just kind of as a fun, like I had nothing to do. And I got a ton of positive feedback, and I got emails from parents saying, my kids are reading your blog. Like, this is awesome. Because it's sometimes hard to listen to adults preaching, because as a child, your parents are always telling you, do this, do that. And so hearing it from another teenager meant a lot to them. And so then I roll around to my summer of, I think it was freshman year. And I had nothing to do, and I'm not someone who likes to sit around and watch Netflix. So I was like, I'm going to write a book. And I've had a ton of amazing mentors up to that point and through till now that have helped and pushed me towards writing and investing and learning more. And so they really helped me. And my book features a ton of like people from the Motley Fool and people just professional investors that have really helped me and guided me. And so that's kind of how I got interested in it.
Yeah. Well, what were you wasting all that time between 9 years old and 13 before you started really
It was a
getting
lot
into
of
it?
reading. Yeah, it was a lot of reading, but always interested in business and playing around as a child does.
Yeah. I don't think that's most kids, but that's good for you for finding something that really sets you on fire so early.
Thank you.
So, question number two, with your kind of unique view of looking at this from somebody who's still very young, what are three tips or your best tips for young investors?
I would say tip number one is probably like take advantage of the investment community because it's a wide, vast majority of people who invest. And a lot of people have the hobby of investing and it's not their main job. And a lot of people go from, being like scientists or mathematicians or people in politics that go into investment fields. And so it's huge
Diversity of,
differences,
yeah.
right? Diversity of people that are investors. And so then there's all of these communities, and there's conferences that are happening in almost every single city, and there's shareholders meetings that you can always attend. And especially as a young person, I know that um, my experience is I'll email any professional investor, and them looking back, thinking about like when they started, they probably think, oh, if I started 10 years earlier, 5 years earlier, probably even a year earlier, I could have A, made this much more money, but more importantly, learned this much more and been able to experience a lot more. And so everyone is happy to help. And I've never gotten a single no from anybody. I've gotten a lot of, oh, I'm sorry, like I'm really busy right now, or I can't because of my job. But here are like four contacts, and I'm happy to give you an intro. And so they're always happy to help and happy to like push you in that direction and encourage you. And so I really think just, going to a few shareholders meetings, whether or not you're invested in the company or whether or not you want to be or you want to invest in it or your parents do, just going and building that community and having mentors to help you and meet people. Because investing really is about learning, and there's no way to learn unless you experience those. I would also say just realizing that you're young, and so you don't have to pay rent for the most part, and so you have the luxuries of you have $10 from your parents, and so if you lose the $10, it's not that big of a deal. That just means you don't get your candy. So if you rather invest it or do something else with it, save it even, that's going to mean a lot more in the future. And it's also, if you lose $10 and you're trying to pay your college debt bills or you're trying to pay your rent, like that becomes a problem. But $10 now is a lot less important.
Hmm.
And investing is a lot about like learning from your mistakes. And so if you're able to learn and say, oh shoot, I lost, $2,100 now, like I said, it's not going to really mean anything because that doesn't mean there won't be food on your table tonight. For the most part, it just means that you're not going to have that money. And if it works out really well and you learn, then that means you're going to have a good setup for your future.
Hmm.
Um,
So you have really
and
cheap lessons
Right,
at
cheap
that
lessons.
age.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then, so my third one would just kind of be similar along the lines of like, just do it because it's like really good experience. And you need to learn about business too, because regardless of what career you go into, you're going into a business. And so seeing how that works out and learning just metrics and math and different ways is important. So I would say just go out there and do that.
Great. So, question number three, and you're 16 now. You've written a book, blogging. You've been introduced to all these amazing people. What does life look like for you in 10 years? Do you have any ideas on that?
I have a few. So when I was really young, I was determined that I was going to go to Columbia University and I was going to be the CEO or CFO of Mattel because that was the first stock I bought. And I had a whole board in my room that was like a huge whiteboard that covered like probably like a quarter of the wall of all the female CFOs that I knew of, and like Ruth Porat in the center and how they got there. And so then I would map out my future. But since then, I've obviously had a lot of really cool experiences that have like broadened my interests. So like I'm super interested in computer programming now, and that I've volunteered for an organization called Coder Dojo, which is like you help people with like Scratch and Python and helping like I think there's some people don't even know how to read and they just come in. And so it's really interesting and inspiring to do that too. And then I'm also really interested in science. And so I have a few internships at like the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. One of them studying the twilight zone, which is basically like where there's that huge drop off in the ocean
Uh-huh.
from the like thousands of um, meters from the sea level.
Yeah, right
And
above the abyss, I think is where.
right,
Yeah.
right, yeah, and nobody knows anything about it. And so I'm doing a coding project in MATLAB and Python and R for them. And it's really interesting because I get to analyze all the photos because they have this holographic camera because obviously there's no light down there. And so it's a laser that goes to a camera. And then it's kind of like when you drop a pebble in like an ocean, how there's like the diffraction lines around it. And so it does that. And then the program just kind of like reassembles it to make it like recognizable and saying, oh, this is a zooplankton or a cephalopod. And so it's really interesting and cool. And then I have another one about phytoplankton because obviously phytoplankton are like the base of the food chain and so super duper important. And so it just studies like how as the climate's changing, the ocean's nutrients levels are shifting a lot. And so like the nitrogen levels are shifting and diatoms and dinoflagellates, which are diatoms are good in high abundance and dinoflagellates cause red tide in high abundance. So just seeing how those change and shifting. So I've had a lot of really cool experiences and a lot of cool things. And I think a lot of what I am interested in can like mesh together to probably form a cool career. But I just have a lot of interest right now and I have to filter them down to one shortly, but I'm still figuring it out.
Well, that's good. I recently read this book called Range by David Epstein, and he's talking about match quality. Basically, like how do you figure out where your best interests and skills and everything align?
Yeah.
And he basically said like don't be in too big of a hurry to get like committed to any one track. Keep following different things, and especially because you yourself, your interests and skills will change over time. Especially like you've changed the most probably from like 20 to 30. So everyone gets locked into these majors and careers at like 18, and then it's like, well, it turns out I actually don't want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it is that
Right.
you just spent 10 years figuring out how to do.
Right.
So yeah, sounds like
Yeah, that's
you're well
super
on your way.
interesting. Yeah.
So question number 4, how did you develop a relationship with the Motley Fool? Because there's a lot
So
of interviews in your book with different people at Motley Fool.
yeah. No, I have a lot of connections with them. When I was in fifth grade, right after I started investing, I applied for a college women in investing workshop there, just kind of for practice for applications in case I wanted to do something in the future. And I was like, oh, I have a down Friday night and I don't know what to do. So I applied and then I got an email back probably a month later that's like, we would love to fly you out here and you can come and have like coffee with Tom and David Gardner. And I was like, oh my
I don't
gosh.
drink
And
coffee. I'm
so,
in 5th grade.
right. I'm like, I don't care. I'll start drinking coffee. That's fine. Whatever. I get to have like coffee with them. That's awesome. Um, and so it was an incredible experience, and I got to meet a ton of amazing people like Lou Ann Lofton, who I was already inspired by because her book is about women in finance, Invest Like a Girl, and well, it's about Warren Buffett, but
Yeah.
how that like women, and so I got to meet a ton of Motley Fool people, and the community there too is so. I mean, if you listen to any of their podcasts, it's fun, it's funny, it's lighthearted. There's like pinball machines everywhere. And so as a fifth grader, that seemed super duper appealing too. And so I just kind of hit it off with them and emailed with them. And then I decided that I wanted to write something. And so they have people can just write like freelance for them. And so I was like, oh, I want to write an article. This would be fun. And so they hooked me up with an editor who worked, I think, nonstop for like 4 months with me just to write probably something that's like this long and now completely incorrect because it was about how Mattel's better than Hasbro in all ways possible. And so it was crazy because I learned that, writing is really about rewriting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not writing and writing and writing. It's just, oh, that was wrong. I'm going to change that. Or it would sound better this way. And so I don't think I would have been able to like write my book or even the blog or even school, like doing essays at school. It's really important. It was a huge learning lesson for me. So it was with this woman, Hope Nelson Pope, and then she's like, I can help you, and we can reach out to other people, and you can have them read it. And so I was able to meet people that way too. And then I corresponded with them they have the Fool School initiative. So they go into schools and they teach kids about investing. And so I got to be on their phone calls and like act as a 16-year-old, like, oh, they
Liaison,
would
yeah.
be right, right. Like they wouldn't be interested in that, but they're really interesting and really great. But it was really just remarkable that they like invested in me when I was so young and continue to. But it's really, like I said, if you're young and you reach out to them, investors are happy to help you and like encourage you. Yeah.
What do your parents do?
They're a software engineer and a florist.
Okay, interesting
Yeah.
combination.
So interesting, but
And
they're both
do you
big
have,
business people.
yeah, I was gonna say, do you have any insights on maybe like what they did to make you turn out the way that you're turning out right now?
Yeah.
This is for my own stuff, for my own kids. Actually, I just want to
That's
steal their
awesome.
ideas.
Yeah, they were just, I think a lot of it is the family spirit of like, it's the community of investors. And so we come home and we just talk about like what investments we had, or what investments we were looking at. And we have this thing we have a competition, a portfolio competition every
Within the
quarter
family.
within the family.
Okay.
And so we see who wins. I won almost consecutively for like the past, I don't know, 4 years or something like that. So proud of that. And so it's just that kind of community that it's like we're not all the best at it. And I mean, we're not Warren Buffett, but it's just having fun with it. And then using terms that you see in investments a lot. And like, I think there's a lot of barriers to investing, and a lot of it has to do with like, you open the book and there's like a billion words that nobody can understand. And so if you use that on a day-to-day basis, it's like Friday night dinner, say, oh, what companies are you looking at? What's their PA ratio? And then when kids open their book up, or when they go to a conference or a shareholders meeting and they hear those things, they're not as turned off by it. And they're like, oh, I know what that is. And it's like, it's another word. And so it's just a lot about the community building. And we would go and road trips and we'd see like, oh, there's Cracker Barrel. We own shares in Cracker Barrel. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Or we can only stop at this gas station because we own shares in that gas station. And so it was just kind of that, and seeing how it interacts in the real world. Like Tom and David Gardner, when they would walk down the aisles and their parents would point out, oh, yeah, like there's General Mills, there's these companies or that company. And so it was just kind of seeing the real world connection.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. So this question number 5, and this is maybe a little bit of probably the toughest question I'm going to ask you today.
Yeah.
But what are some of the dangers of a Peter Lynch style of, buy what you know? You're walking down the aisle and you see this company or this Mattel, for instance, things that you
Right,
know.
right.
Where can you go wrong in the investment world if that's sort of like your driving principle?
hmm So I think it's a lot about, you hear a lot about diversification with your stocks. And so a lot of people think that's just like companies, right? And so it's like, oh, I could have, sticking with the toy companies, I could have Mattel, but I'm just diversifying with having 50% of my money in Mattel and 50% in Hasbro. But not everyone's interested in toys. Like kids want iPhones now and they want, different games on the Google Pixel or that or this. And so those companies are sticking out. So having your money in a sector, because normally when you know something, you'll know the entire sector, or a good amount about that. That's not a good idea because that's not really diversification. So diversification would have to be between sectors also. Um, and so I think buying what you know is important for when you start, because like I said, I started with Mattel and I was really interested because I was holding this American Girl doll, and then one day I was like, I actually own part of this American Girl doll. Like I own
Yeah.
her, but I own who makes her. Like that just seemed really cool. And so that kind of like connection when you're young is really important. And it's not even when you're young, just when you're starting out. But then I think it's more about like knowing what you buy. And so understanding why you bought it and what you bought it. Because going back to kind of what I've said this time is that investing is a lot about learning and reading and learning from others and talks and all of that. That like this year I've bought a lot of shares in like insurance companies, and I'm 16 years old. Like, what do I know about
Yeah.
insurance? I probably know more about teenage trends than I do. Um, but I've read a lot. I've gone to a lot of shareholders meetings. I've talked to a lot of people. And so I'm like, now I know this. And so it's kind of, you don't want to get stuck in that one place or that one sector. Like, oh, I only know, I use paper towels every day. Everyone uses paper towels every day,
Yeah.
but pushing yourself and getting yourself out of your comfort zone. And also, like I said, as a young person, it's fine if you test and you're like, oh, I want to try, investing in these sort of companies, that if you don't do very well, and it's not going to be the end of the world for you. And you actually probably learn more about the company too after you lose money, because you learn, oh, maybe that metric was more important than I thought it was, or maybe I underestimated their debt, or maybe some this or that. And so I think it's probably more about know what you buy rather than buy what you know.
That's great. Yeah. How does valuation then fit in with what you tell kids? Because that's a very difficult thing to like. Well, I'm going to value what this business is worth. Like,
Right.
it's one thing to know, like, oh, American dolls are or American Girl dolls are popular, but what am I paying to actually, participate in the ownership?
Right, right. And I think a lot of that is it's hard as a young person to thinking about numbers. And so like when I invested in Mattel, I looked, and it's on my Motley Fool article. It was just like, oh, that meets the guidelines. So check, like, and so it was more of like, oh, check that box, check that box, check that box, rather than really understanding like the valuation of the company, and or the big picture of the company also. And so I think it's definitely really important, and I go over a lot of that in my book too. But yeah, I think it's definitely important, and that's kind of the harder concept. The easier concept is being like, oh, and that's why it's easier to start with companies that you know too. And so then you can be like, okay, it's probably a reasonable company, because as a young person, you don't understand those, green energy or these kind of far-fetched ideas, and so, or not far-fetched ideas, but more harder to understand ideas.
Yeah, non-consumer good kind of a.
Yeah, right. And so then those are easier to understand and probably closer to the like, okay, they meet the boxes I need to check, and then that's fine.
So last question we always ask is for a book recommendation. So what do you have for us today?
I am really interested in math, and obviously, and so it's The Infinite Powers on How Calculus Reveals the Secrets of the Universe. It's by Steven Sturgatz. I have this pulled it up right here.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting, and it's kind of so calculus is a lot about like taking like tiny little pieces of things and then solving the tiny pieces and then putting it into like one big thing. And I think that relates a lot to investing too, is that you can see all these little numbers, but it doesn't make sense until you put like all the numbers together, or all the parts of like why this company has so much debt. Like, oh, they bought a new storage facility. Oh, they, hired this many more people. And so then if you put that together, you're like, oh, that makes sense, but it's not going to always be like that. And so anyways, the book was super duper interesting, and it had a lot of like real world applications. And as a young person too, going through like the math classes, it's kind of frustrating to say, oh, this is never going to be used in the real world.
Yeah. And
calculus is like the first place that you're like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Like I can measure a vase and then say, oh, the area or the volume of this vase is that. I don't have to fill it up with water. I can just do it with math. And so the book really shows you that, and it kind of splits up the entire universe in these tiny little parts and like puts it all together in a really understandable and approachable way. It's definitely a harder read, just with the math concepts, but really, really interesting.
Yeah, Strogatz is. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name correctly, but he's
I'm not sure if I am either.
he's one of my favorite authors for that very reason of taking what seems like very difficult math concepts and then making them understandable. And his writing styles I found to be relatively approachable given the subject matter that he's starting with.
It's just like, it's the math part of the leap. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, Maya, thanks so much for coming on the show, and can't wait to see what else you do in life. Congrats on a great start.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Before you go, do me the huge honor of picking up your copy of The Rebel Allocator, available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. It's a business person's guide to effective capital allocation, told in a coming-of-age story of a college grad who crosses paths with a wealthy Midwesterner. It's fiction for the nonfiction reader. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this interview. If you'd like to support this author and purchase their book, click here. If you'd like to become a subscriber to 5GQ, click here. And I included a couple other interviews that you might appreciate right here. Thanks. Happy reading.